Dr. Early, could you please state your full name and spell your last name for the record?
My name is Paul Henry Early, E-A-R-L-E-Y.
And sir, are you a medical doctor?
I am.
And sir, do you understand you've been hired by the corporation AEG Live and some of its executives and related companies to testify here today against Katherine Jackson and Michael Jackson's 3 children?
My understanding is I was hired by the law firm, but that's the closest I can come to that, yeah.
Hired by the law firm for the defendants?
Yes.
And what are they called?
O'Melveny and Meyer.
And how much are they paying you?
I'm not sure I know the exact dollar figure for each of my pieces, around $300 an hour for research and $500 an hour for deposition.
And why do you want to testify against Mrs. Jackson and Michael's 3 children?
I was asked for my legal opinion in the matter, and it's of intellectual curiosity to me.
When you say legal opinion, are you an attorney?
I'm sorry, my medical opinion was a mistake.
So you're going to testify, you're going to give your medical opinion today?
I am.
Is that right?
I'm going to give, my opinion is to certain matters regarding propofol, and not for or against any particular position. It's just my opinion.
And you're doing this for money, correct?
Correct.
And for your own intellectual curiosity, as you said?
Correct.
Sir, what type of doctor are you?
I'm an addiction medicine specialist.
And what does that mean?
That means I care for individuals that suffer from substance abuse and related addiction disorders.
And sir, what qualifies you to be an addiction Sir, what qualifies you to be an addiction medicine specialist?
The addiction medicine as a field, when I entered it, had no specific qualifications, but over the past 28 years of doing it, there's been a certification process, and more recently a board certification process.
And sir, are you board certified in addiction medicine?
I am.
When did you become board certified?
The first year the test was offered, and I think that was 2009.
Do you know what month in 2009 you were board certified?
I do not.
And what specific training have you had in addiction medicine that allows you to be a specialist?
Well, my initial training was in neurology, so I have extensive knowledge of brain pharmacology, neuropharmacology, neurophysiology. And then since then I've had training in psychotherapy, experiential psychotherapy, and because there was no specific training when I started off, it was basically on-the-job training with other addiction experts. And that's initially how I learned that, and then took any kind of certification tests and exams that were necessary over the years.
And sir, how many years in total would you say you've been working or training that have led you to become an addiction medicine specialist?
28.
And sir, I've seen everything on your website and all your articles, and you've done a lot of interviews and written a lot of articles on the subject, correct?
That's correct.
It's all very impressive. And you consider yourself an expert in that, correct?
I consider myself an expert in most areas of addiction medicine. There's some areas that I know less about, but in general, yes.
Sir, are you qualified to treat patients who have addiction?
I am.
And are you qualified to treat patients who have dependency on chemicals?
Absolutely.
Now, sir, are you qualified to treat patients who are addicted to opioids?
Yes.
And what gives you that qualification?
My ASAM certification and 28 years experience, and also a teacher in the field.
And sir, are you qualified to treat patients who are addicted to propofol?
I am.
And what gives you that qualification?
Because I have treated more propofol-dependent people than probably any single clinician in the United States.
And also your 28 years of experience in the field?
Correct.
And your board certification as an addiction medicine specialist?
Correct.
And sir, are you qualified, is Demerol an opioid?
It is.
Sir, are you qualified to treat patients who are addicted to or dependent on Demerol?
Yes.
And what gives you that qualification?
The same as the previous.
28 years experience, board certification, personal experience treating them?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
That is a yes.
And sir, what's a benzodiazepine?
Benzodiazepine is a large class of drugs that are sedative drugs. They're also used for sleep induction.
And sir, are you qualified to treat patients who are addicted to or dependent on benzodiazepines?
I am.
And what gives you that qualification?
The same process, certification, experience, and being a teacher in the field.
Let's take propofol addiction or dependency. Do you think if a patient is going to be treated for propofol addiction or dependency, do you think it's important that a qualified doctor treat them for that, or is it okay if any old type of doctor treats them for that?
I think that qualification is a broad term, and there are various ways to attain to become qualified. But I believe some type of qualification is important when treating any type of illness.
And so, sir, you actually run a facility that treats addicted patients, correct?
Not at present. I've done that up until January of 2012, February of 2012, and now I'm running what's called a physician's health program in Georgia.
And what does that mean, a physician's health program?
What we do is monitor what we do is help physicians who have addiction disorders get treatment, obtain good treatment, and monitor their long-term recovery from their chemical dependence disorder.
So fair statement, what you're doing now is you're involved in the long-term overall monitoring of physicians who have been treated for addiction or dependency.
Correct.
Before you did what you're doing now, you did run a treatment center?
For most of my career, yes. Yeah.
And how many years did you run the treatment center?
I've run 3 separate treatment centers during my career, and that has lasted 27 of my 28 years of working in addiction.
Let's take your the last sort of entity that you were running that was an addiction treatment center, okay?
Good.
What was that called?
It's called Talbot Recovery Campus.
Did you ever have any celebrities who were treated at, without telling me who they are, any celebrities who were treated at Talbot Recovery Services?
I did.
Did you ever have a situation where you turned away a patient for treatment at Talbot Recovery Services and said, no, why don't you just go see a cardiologist?
If we had someone that had cardiovascular disease, we would refer them out to take care of the cardiovascular disease, if that's what you're asking.
No, what I'm asking is, did you ever have someone come in and you know, they said, hey, I have an addiction to opioids, for example, and you said, no, we're not going to treat you here at Talbot Recovery. You would be better served just by going off and finding some random cardiologist. Did you ever do that?
We would never send a patient to a random doctor.
Because such a doctor would not be a specialist in treating people with addiction, correct?
Actually, I was more aimed at the fact that we wouldn't send anyone to a random physician.
And so, in other words, you would check out whichever physician you were going to send them to, correct?
We would know of that physician's qualifications.
What would you do to find out about that?
We would know about that physician's past history of work. We would know about their educational background. We would know about their past skills. We would know about maybe past patients that they had treated.
Would you do make any efforts to determine whether that doctor was financially desperate in any way, in such a way that they might make bad decisions?
I don't think that would enter into our decisions.
But you would at least find out what kind of doctor they were?
Yeah. What kind of doctor and what their skill set was.
And sir, fair statement that you are an advocate for helping people who have addiction, correct?
Absolutely.
Sir, have you ever heard the term enabler?
Yes, I have.
What is an enabler?
Well, that's a term that's in the common lingua franca, the common language, that refers to an individual that instead of helping someone get better out of what feels like kindness, actually is hurtful for their addiction.
And so the term enabler, does it come from the concept that they are actually, while they think they're helping, they're actually enabling the addiction?
That is correct.
And what about the term codependency? Have you heard that?
I have.
And what is codependency?
It's another term that is not used in the addiction field anymore, but it's prevalent in the general world, where people think of individuals that are so close to an individual that they wind up not being able to figure out how to best help the person that they love or they care for.
Sir, have you ever seen a situation where an addicted person was being enabled by another person who had something to gain from that addicted person?
I guess I could construct a situation where that might occur, yeah.
I've been doing some research on, enabling and codependency, and I've read certain things like sometimes a person can be considered a codependent to an addict when they stay close to the addict because they rely on that addict for some reason, and then they therefore become an enabler because they want to keep the situation going. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I don't think that's actually an accurate description, but I hear that's how you see it. I think that's actually what one would call secondary gain.
Okay, explain that for me, secondary gain.
Secondary gain is where you're involved in a situation where you the agenda is not to be helpful in getting that person better, but some other issue, such as you don't want your husband, who's a physician, to not be able to work.
So in the sort of example you put at the end there, that could be a situation where a spouse of a physician wants that physician to keep working, and so enables that physician's addiction. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's clear enough.
And then in terms of enablers, is it a fair statement that often enablers provide addicts with the means to be able to continue their addiction, for example, with finances?
I guess I could construe a situation where that might occur, yes.
And, I think this is, and often enablers might want to be willfully blind to the addiction. Is that a fair statement?
Most enablers are not willfully blind. Most enablers are, their intent is benevolent and to be helpful, but they can't see the problem because addiction is a disease of secrecy and confusion. So oftentimes an enabler can't see it.
My question is, based on what you've reviewed, you knew that Dr. Murray was giving Michael Jackson medicine to feed his addiction, correct?
I don't agree with that. I think that what Dr. Murray was doing was, at the time, what he felt was the best thing in helping him sleep. Now, was this misguided in retrospect? Obviously, that seems to be the case.
You're not telling the jury that you think that what Dr. Murray did was okay, are you?
I'm not.
Was it okay for Dr. Murray to administer propofol to Michael Jackson in a home setting like he did?
No.
That was wrong, correct?
That was medically incorrect.
And would you ever do that?
I would not.
Why not?
Well, that goes to my opinion, and my opinion about the matter of propofol is that he did not have proper monitoring of a CO2 level or his breathing level or his oxygenation. He did not have proper rescue equipment available for him. He was giving a medication which had a steep dose response curve, which makes it difficult to judge the exact right dose. He gave that medication after giving him lorazepam and Valium, diazepam. And as a result, he created synergy with the other drugs, which placed him at risk. And he was using an intravenous introduction technique which was non-standard and which was prone to develop problems such as pulmonary emboli from clots from leg veins.
And did you also see Dr. Murray's phone records on the day that Michael Jackson died?
I did look at them. I can't describe them verbatim, but I did look at them.
Did you see he was on the phone a lot during the time he was purporting to be treating Michael Jackson?
I did.
Is that appropriate for a physician to do that?
Not, it is not, and the reason it is not is because continuous monitoring is indicated, which places Michael Jackson at high risk for not surviving that technique.
And sir, based on your review of the record, you understand that Dr. Murray is in prison for killing Michael Jackson, correct?
Dr. Murray is in jail, to the best of my knowledge.
And you're of the opinion that nobody should be administering propofol just to get someone to sleep, correct?
Propofol is not an appropriate agent for sleep induction.
And nobody should be giving propofol to somebody just because that somebody might get some sense of euphoria out of it, correct?
Propofol is not a drug, no drugs are used in medicine for the production of euphoria.
Well, if someone had steered Michael Jackson your way in 2009, do you believe you could have done a better job treating any addiction you may have had?
Under the circumstances that were present at the time, I don't think I could have done a better job in terms of getting him in recovery, if that's what your question is.
Is there any level of propofol that someone can be on where they can talk?
Yes, you can. This goes to this issue of the steep dose response curve that I was talking about earlier, is that yes, you can be in that state, but the change in the dose between being in a light twilight state and being completely obtunded is very small and varies from time to time, and that means that individuals who are given propofol in an uncontrolled environment are at higher risk for death if they're not properly monitored. Because that steep dose response curve, you can never quite predict when an individual is going to be asleep, twilight state, asleep, or obtunded. And the dose can actually vary from time to time.
So it sounds like administering propofol is a highly technical matter.
It's technical in some ways. When you have proper breathing apparatus around, you don't worry about putting someone too deep because you can always assist in their breathing. And you can always, the other complication of propofol is it also lowers blood pressure, and you can also help the blood pressure with what are called pressor agents which will raise the blood pressure. So those two consequences can be easily maintained in an operative theater.
Sir, in your review of the record materials in this case, did you see anything that indicated that Dr. Murray had oxygen tanks in the Carrollwood house?
I believe he had oxygen tanks, but not any sort of breathing mask or what is called rescue equipment in anesthesia.
So without the breathing mask, he could not keep the breathing going, correct?
Right, because the breathing masks actually provide short-term CPR, if you will, in case you stop breathing.
And is that a common mechanism of death in a propofol overdose?
Stopping breathing can occur in several ways from propofol. One is because of the fact that the laryngeal muscles become lax, and an individual such as Michael Jackson, who has a large tongue, can actually obstruct his breathing apparatus. So that's why if he was being given propofol over a period of time, at any given time, he could obstruct, and he could have died, whoever was giving that propofol. And so that's one way of, you couldn't tell the difference between actually his breathing muscles stopping and the breathing functioning failing because the laryngeal muscles relaxed, the tongue goes back and obstructs the upper airway.
Now in the administration of propofol in an appropriate setting, what is done about the tongue problem?
Two things. There are actually three things. The majority of cases, there is either an airway available, or they're actually intubated, where the breathing tube goes past the upper oropharynx, the upper breathing area, so that it holds that area open. And the third thing one can do is breathe for someone by applying positive pressure with an ambu bag or a similar apparatus.
Okay. And none of these three things were done with regard to Michael Jackson, correct? At the time Mr. Jackson died, none of these three breathing assistance procedures were done, correct?
What I do remember from the record is Conrad Murray did perform CPR on him, so that is essentially the same as an ambu bag. Whether that was too late or not is unclear.
But there wasn't another airway open, correct?
There was not another airway open.
And that would be, what's that called when they cut something in your throat?
Oh, tracheostomy?
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So there wasn't that done, correct?
Correct.
And there wasn't any intubation done, correct?
Correct.
And then but what was done when Dr. Murray saw something was going wrong, he tried CPR, correct?
Correct. To the best of my knowledge, that's what the records reflect.
In working in addiction medicine, I'm assuming sometimes there's patients who need CPR, correct?
Correct.
Is it appropriate in your field to give CPR on a soft bed as opposed to a harder surface?
It's certainly appropriate to put the individual on a hard surface for proper CPR.
Thank you. And sir, do you have an opinion as to whether Michael Jackson in 2009 had an addiction?
In 2009, he did have an addiction, yes.
And what is the basis of that opinion?
The basis of his, are you asking about any specific drug, or are you asking about generally any addiction?
Good question. Well, let me think about that. Do you think he had addictions to more than one drug?
I think he clearly had an addiction to opioids, that class of drugs.
Do you think he had an addiction to any other drugs?
I don't think there's sufficient evidence to, from the record reading, to ascertain whether he was addicted to either propofol or benzodiazepines. There are suggestions in the record, but there's not sufficient information.
With regard to opioids, which drugs within the opioid class do you think Mr. Jackson was addicted to?
The primary drug of his addiction was meperidine, the trade name Demerol. And that was by far and away the most common opioid that he took. There were several cases where he was given other narcotics for pain relief and that sort of thing, but the meperidine was the primary drug that he used in the opioid class.
And that's a more common term usage is Demerol?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes? I'm sorry.
Yes, it is. Yes, that's the trade name, is Demerol.
Now, do you have an opinion with regard to whether Michael Jackson's death was caused by Demerol?
Michael Jackson's death was not caused by Demerol directly. There is a question as to whether the Demerol produces synergy and helped create the death from propofol and benzodiazepines.
Do you know if there was any Demerol in Michael Jackson's system after he died?
I don't remember the exact quantity if there was. What I do know is, but there are other issues involved with the opioids and death.
Okay, so we'll get to that. Let me ask this way. Do you believe a Demerol overdose caused Mr. Jackson's death?
I do not.
Do you believe a benzodiazepine overdose caused his death?
Not benzodiazepines alone. Benzodiazepines in synergy with propofol were most likely causative in his death.
How long in time do you think Michael Jackson was addicted to these classes of drugs?
The opioid drugs, there's evidence of addiction to opioid drugs which dates back into the early 1990s, going to concerns about his long-term prognosis for recovery, because the longer you're on an opiate, the worse your prognosis is for recovery.
What about the propofol? Well, I guess you didn't determine whether or not he was addicted to propofol. Right?
No. I didn't think there was sufficient data in the record for me to reach a conclusion, a conclusive opinion about it.
Now, on the evidence regarding Mr. Jackson being addicted to opioids back from the early 1990s, are you basing that opinion in part on the deposition of Dr. Stuart Finkelstein?
Yes, that was one of the opinions that led me to that, yes.
And did you read the deposition of Dr. Stuart Finkelstein?
I did.
And let's talk about opioid addiction. What are the ways that it can start?
Opioid dependence starts simply enough when people who are susceptible to addiction ingest opioids.
And what makes one susceptible to dependence?
It's multifactorial. The single largest contributor is genetics when you look at large populations. The single strongest determinant is whether your parents had a substance abuse or dependence disorder. But that does not mean that 100% of people that develop addiction have genetics of addiction in their family. The other contributing factors are other psychological issues, early life trauma, access to drugs of abuse, or alcohol in the case of alcohol abuse. And access. I think that I said it, access.
Speculation.
The problem that we have here is a man whose reputation and skill and wonderment exceeded probably 99% of the people on the planet. And I would like to say that I would never do that. But this was a very difficult and different situation. And
He was one of the most beloved entertainers in the world, correct?
absolutely.
And people wanted to be near him, correct?
Correct.
Now, and you would like to say you wouldn't have done what these doctors did, correct?
I would like to say that.
But if you did, if you gave in and you did it, that wouldn't be okay, would it?
It would not be okay.
And, to do what Dr. Murray did was simply not okay, correct?
Which thing that he did? You mean the prescribing the propofol?
Correct.
Prescribing the propofol ultimately resulted in Michael Jackson's death,
Right. And that's not okay.
and that's not okay.
Sir, could you tell me more about withdrawal symptoms from propofol?
This is where the study, where it says study on my sheet.
Yes, sir.
We, in our case study of 22 propofol-dependent individuals, we were able to characterize the withdrawal. And the withdrawal is depression, insomnia, and irritability. Those are the three hallmarking signs of withdrawal.
Sir, did you, based on your review of the record, did you see any of the symptoms of propofol withdrawal in Michael Jackson?
Mr. Jackson most likely had some baseline insomnia, which was paradoxically worsened by the use of benzodiazepines and propofol.
And so you believe that his insomnia, with regard to propofol, his insomnia was worsened by the propofol use?
Correct. Yes.
Or worsened by the propofol, or the withdrawal from propofol?
Yeah, I mean, they're both the same.
Okay.
You get the drug, you're going to get the withdrawal at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess my question is to make it real simple. When you're given the propofol, you're out.
Right.
So
when you take away the propofol, you have the insomnia after the propofol is no longer administered.
And sir, what about chills? Is chills a symptom of propofol use or withdrawal?
We don't, people can be irritable. We haven't actually seen chills. We have had individuals that have had seizures associated with propofol withdrawal, but not specifically chills.
Did you see in the record anywhere that Michael Jackson showed up for rehearsal shortly before he died and was suffering extreme chills?
I did.
Do you have an opinion on what that was all about?
Chills is a very generic symptom and could mean anything from the flu to, some other, a cold, low blood sugar. There's lots of different reasons why people have chills, and it's a fairly nonspecific symptom.
Now, sir, you're qualified in and an expert in getting people off drugs, correct?
Correct.
And is it appropriate to take a person who's addicted to Demerol? Is it an appropriate practice to just cut them off cold turkey?
Discontinuing opioids cold turkey is not life-threatening. It can be done, and there are people that will do that. And as a matter of fact, before we had certain detox drugs, that's what I would do. But it is not the current practice today, now that we have other medications to help detoxify opioid-dependent individuals.
And what is the current practice today?
Is to taper on a drug called buprenorphine.
And sir, are you familiar with a drug called Suboxone?
That is buprenorphine.
And could you explain what that is?
Suboxone is a drug which contains buprenorphine as its primary ingredient, and then the secondary ingredient is something called naloxone. And the reason, do you want to know technically why it's
Sure.
a combination? Okay. The naloxone is placed in the Suboxone, so people that are chemically dependent or addicted can't take the Suboxone and grind it up and inject it, because the naloxone, if injected, blocks the effect of the buprenorphine. But if you take it orally, it's not absorbed, so that you can have the buprenorphine detoxification without consequences, but it can't be injected.
And sir, did you see any evidence in the record that Mr. Jackson was treated by anybody with Suboxone?
I saw evidence in the record that he was treated with buprenorphine earlier, but I think it was by Dr. Gordon, if I remember correctly.
Do you know when that was?
I don't. I don't remember the dates.
Did you see any evidence in the record that Dr. Conrad Murray was treating Mr. Jackson with buprenorphine?
I did not.
Can we just call it Suboxone because it's easier to say?
Absolutely.
Okay, did Suboxone exist in 2009?
It did.
And were you treating people with Suboxone in 2009?
I was.
What about propofol addiction? What's the proper way to treat propofol addiction, to get somebody off the drug?
When people are addicted to propofol, you just stop it.
And why is that?
Propofol is a short-acting drug, so discontinuing it is not life-threatening. There are, under the vast majority of consequences, actually we've had several cases where we did have to give sedative drugs to prevent patients from seizing, but these are healthcare professionals who are taking huge quantities of propofol. Under normal circumstances, you discontinue the propofol, and occasionally you'll give a sedative drug for several days because patients are agitated or irritable, but there's no other detoxification that's used.
And what about benzodiazepine? What's the appropriate way to get somebody off of benzodiazepines?
Benzodiazepines require a cautious, careful taper. Some individuals are very sensitive to benzodiazepines, and it's a very difficult drug to get off of. It's probably, despite the fact that they're medically safe, detoxification is difficult. So a slow, tapered decrease over time is the way to do that.
Was that the practice in 2009?
It was.
But when I say get people cleaned up, I'm talking about getting them off the drugs. You understand that?
Yeah.
That's what you've been trying to get people off of drugs, correct?
I get people off of drugs.
And you do that for their health, correct?
That is correct.
Because any other way would be not appropriate, correct?
I practice medicine based on the patient's health.
You're not going to answer my question.
I don't, I don't make my medical decisions based upon a corporate decision. I make my decisions based on the health of my patients. So I can't answer the question like that because I base my decisions on my relationship with my patient.
And you're a good and ethical doctor, correct?
I would like to think I am.
And all those things that you just testified, that's something that Talbot Recovery would have tried to assist with Michael Jackson, correct?
The operative word in your question is tried. The problem is severalfold. First of all, he was taking opiates for a prolonged period of time, which decreases his prognosis. Two is that he had this legendary status which caused people, unfortunately, to set aside proper boundaries and would cause someone to prescribe drugs for him. Three, he was providing financial resources for a lot of his family so that would render them impotent in being able to effectively intervene on him. Four, he was extremely secretive in terms of his style. He cordoned off one physician from another. He wouldn't talk about his drug use when asked about it from physician B to physician A. And all of those things predict, tragically, a huge tragedy, predict a very grave outcome.
If Michael Jackson had been sent to your recovery center, how would you have treated him?
I would have, at the front door, asked if tried to understand if the family could all stand behind him not obtaining drugs and understand they have an addiction disorder. I would have told him at the front door that because his addiction, through no fault of his own, was quite severe, that he needs a prolonged period of rehabilitation, multiple months, probably, more than 3, less than a year in initial treatment. I would have told him that he needs to be on naltrexone after treatment. I would have looked for alternative ways of managing his pain. I would have to figure out how to close down his access to opioids from other sources, which would have been, in his case, a Herculean task, contacting every senior doctor, having us contact every pharmacy, closing down all prescriptions at all of his pharmacies. I would have given him a series of skills that are called drug refusal skills around opioids. And I would have worked to unearth the tragic secrecy that was surrounding all of his drug use, which unfortunately contributed to his terrible death.
Now, the first thing you said is try to understand if his family would stand behind him to, make sure he doesn't get drugs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a yes?
We have
That
to
is
say
yes.
for the
But you're not saying you have any information that his family was getting him drugs, are you?
No, there's no evidence. I'm completely clear that his family wanted nothing but the best for him.
And in fact, you read in the records that his family tried to do interventions for him, right?
Yes, and one intervention failed because they came to see him and he appeared quite healthy, and so the intervention was diffused at that point, which is sad but true.
But you have no information that the family didn't do the best job they could do to try to do what they could do, right?
Correct. The problem comes from the fact that it comes from this issue of power. That's why it's much more difficult, for instance, to treat the patriarch of a family versus the patriarch's grandson. Does that make sense? That if the power in the family if the power in the family emanates, and in our society a lot of that power comes from supporting people financially, it's very hard for a family member to get past that. So we would have had to do an enormous amount of work to get past the natural resistance to give in to his requests. I want to be clear that by saying that, I'm not inferring that the family was in any manner, shape, or form getting drugs for him or helping support his addiction. But
because there's no evidence of that, right?
I think there's zero evidence of that. They loved him and they wanted him better.
And sir, you're aware also, at the time Michael Jackson died, his immediate family consisted of himself and 3 young children, correct?
Correct.
And then his elderly mother, who he supported, correct?
Correct.
And you don't think the 3 young children or his elderly mother were getting him drugs, right?
I absolutely do not.
Okay.
I have no thoughts of that.
And sir, then you said the second thing was, you would let him know that his addiction was serious through no fault of his own, correct?
Correct.
And so you don't believe that Michael Jackson's addiction was his fault, correct?
No. Addiction is a biologic disease that once it gets going overrides a lot of the things that allow us to make good decisions in life.
And so it's not the addict's fault, correct?
Correct.
And so if somebody were trying to point the finger at Michael Jackson and saying his death is all his own fault, would you agree with that?
I've dedicated my career to taking care of the addicted people in this planet, okay? And so it's important for you to know that I would stand strongly against anyone that would blame the addict for their problem. That doesn't mean, however, that the addict has to at some point take responsibility for their recovery. And that doesn't occur right away. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes, and that's really why treatment takes so long. So no, I don't believe it's proper to blame the addict. Most people that are addicted, tragically, in our society especially, blame themselves. Not true, by the way, in European cultures, but they blame themselves. They have shame about their illness. They develop secrecy, and that's exactly what we saw in this case. Is secrecy, hiding, having one doctor not talk to another, lest one find out that the Demerol was being given by another. That's the kind of stuff we saw.
In addiction medicine, a way you collect data is by meeting and interviewing the patient, correct?
That is part, but not the only way we do that, yes.
And I don't think anyone would disagree with you on this. But here, obviously, you have not been able to meet
I have
Mr.
not.
Jackson.
Tragically. Would have liked to.
I'm sorry, just for the record. Here, unfortunately, you have not been able to meet Mr. Jackson, correct?
Correct.
And similarly, you've not been able to meet anybody from his family, correct?
That's correct.
And so you were not able to gather any data directly from Mr. Jackson or his family, correct?
That's correct.
And sir, with regard to overcoming addiction, is it a fair statement that something that's important to consider is a person's motivation to overcome the addiction?
That's a complicated subject, and I'll try to make the answer short. Some people can overcome addiction with very little initial motivation. Motivation down the road, once people have some time abstinent from the drugs, does become important.
And based on your experience, what kind of motivations have you seen that have enabled people to overcome their addiction?
Everyone gets their motivation from a different source. Some people might be motivated by their medical license or their pilot's license or their law license. Other people might be motivated by family, by by getting their pride in their name back. So motivation is a complex thing, and for each person it's a little different.
And sir, did you see anything in the record regarding Mr. Jackson's selfless love for his children?
I did.
And what did you understand Mr. Jackson's relationship with his children to be?
Universally, what was stated in the record from many, many sources is his dedication to his children, his compassion with his children, his wanting the best for his children, and his desires to be a good parent, I guess, would be inferred from that.
And sir, is that the type of thing that if Mr. Jackson were given proper treatment for his addiction, that type of motivation for his children, could that have gotten him through the rough patches down the line?
Certainly one could posit that that would be highly contributory. There's more to it than that, but that would posit that's that.
And so, unlike some addicts who may not, to use a very simple expression, may not have a lot to live for in terms of family or career, Mr. Jackson was not that way, correct?
That's correct.
If Mr. Jackson had been given appropriate treatment and had he accepted that, he could have at least perhaps gotten over the hump on the road to recovery, correct?
That you're assuming lots of different variables, and I think that there are other variables to account for his prognosis long term, but his love for his children and his dedication to his children would certainly help.
And sir, did you see anything in the record that was given to you that the reason that Mr. Jackson was doing the This Is It tour was because of his children?
I remember some statements in the record that indicated that he wanted to have his children see him perform when they were of age to remember that, and that he wanted to be a good dad and an example.
What is addiction memory?
Addiction memory is a phrase that I coined. It's not in the general parlance of addiction work, but it's my effort to bring it into the fore. What happens when one becomes addicted is deep neural circuits entrain the brain to preserve the behaviors which make sure that the addiction continues, such as if someone finds out that that every time they go to John Smith's house, they can get hydrocodone. They can purchase hydrocodone. The route to John Smith's house is deeply embedded in the brain. It retrains the brain to see that as important. It resets the high priority, and it's what's called procedural learning. The brain literally learns unconsciously how to ensure that the drug supply is maintained. And it is my belief that this is one of the crucial aspects of addiction. And unwinding it is a crucial thing to do in treatment.
And so, sir, I saw on one of the videos on your website you were talking about addiction memory and you used an example of someone who's an alcoholic and they might have been off alcohol for a while and they're driving home from work and then the next thing they know they're just in the parking lot of their old bar.
You really did watch that video, didn't you?
Yes.
Yeah, that's my usual example.
And that was so with Michael Jackson, would it be, to sort of put it in layperson's terms, when he found himself with the doctor, that sort of triggered his unconscious desire for the drugs?
Yeah, and we even have a few examples of that, in one case, he told, I believe it was Dr. Adams, I don't want opiates, don't give me any Demerol, and then by the end of the procedure, he asked for Demerol. And so that was a triggering of this circuit, it's conditioned cue craving, something in the environment, being around a doctor triggered him to that kind of unconscious drive to find ways and means of getting more.
And sir, before we go on to Exhibit 25, back on addiction memory, you brought up the episode with Dr. Adams where Mr. Jackson started out saying, "Don't give me any opioids," and then by the end he was begging for them, right?
Begging is an overstatement, but he certainly requested them, yes.
And is that something you had mentioned before about teaching the addict tools to so they can stop it when they notice that they're unconsciously reaching out for the drugs, correct?
Correct, yes.
And is that the kind of tools that you taught at the Talbot Recovery to addicts?
Correct.
And so what would you teach somebody with an opioid addiction about, what tools would you try to give them so they could notice when they were reaching out?
Okay, well, I'm not supposed to say anything funny in a deposition, but the first thing he should do is avoid doctors.
Right.
Because unfortunately doctors became a drug source for him. So the first thing you do is you try to eliminate the high-risk situation. The high-risk situation for him, unfortunately, was being around physicians. Physicians who have a prescription pad, physicians who can write these substances.
So, and I know no human really can avoid doctors for their whole life, so it would be that he just only go to doctors when absolutely necessary?
Only when necessary, and when he would need to go to a physician, he would prepare himself for that encounter, knowing that this unconscious drive would show up. It's ambivalence. On one hand, he was just as sincere at the beginning, saying, "Don't give me any Demerol," as he was at the end when he said, "I want the Demerol." And that's part of the trap that he was in regarding his addiction.
So then it probably was not a good idea, sort of paradoxically, that he had a full-time 24-hour doctor with him, correct?
I think that having a doctor with him who has a prescription pad can be a high-risk situation unless properly prepared for it in someone that's chemically dependent.
So based on your review of the records in the case, did you see any evidence that any doctor other than Dr. Conrad Murray gave Michael Jackson propofol during the last 2 months of his life?
I saw nothing in the record about anyone else giving him propofol in the last 2 months of his life.
Mr. Boyle asked you, in essence, would it be right to blame Mr. Jackson for his death? And you spoke about that from your perspective as an addiction physician. And do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
Okay. And just to be clear, were you speaking at all from a legal perspective there?
I was not.
Do you have any legal opinions about fault for Michael Jackson's death?
Absolutely not. I'm not a lawyer, nor do I understand the law.
Okay. And you also testified that being around physicians was sort of a high risk for someone like Mr. Jackson. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Do you think that means that it wasn't appropriate for Michael Jackson to have medical care?
No, that is not what that means. All that I meant by that testimony was that that being around physicians would trigger drug craving inadvertently, and the fact that the power differential was inverted. In other words, physicians Mr. Jackson would be in the power seat with physicians because of his incredible status. Those things placed him at high risk for continued use or relapse if he had ever obtained substantive recovery.
And sir, you in that discussion, you said something that caught my interest. You said one of the cardinal signs of people who have addiction is that they have shame about their addiction, right?
Correct.
And similar, they have self-loathing, correct?
The shame produces self-loathing in many individuals, yes.